The Y Curve with Phil Dobby and Roger Hearing.
Just days away from millions of youngsters opening an envelope or an email to see if they've got their place at university.
But will the university still be there for them?
The whole higher education system is in crisis. Potential bankruptcies or mergers of universities is on the horizon.
Not enough money, fewer foreign students, and the number applying here has gone down.
The fear of a big loan debt without the guarantee of a good job is turning people off.
So what's going to happen to higher education, and how does it need to change?
The Y Curve.
So is the crisis really that bad? Is it reaching...
So they say.
We've been talking about this for a while, haven't we? That it's a sector that's struggling.
Yeah.
But I guess it's... I mean, the pandemic obviously made people quite... First of all, people weren't going to university, and then it made people question actually their future.
Well, there was a lot of this thing coming from the government, the last government, I should say, about the value of degrees, which we touched on before. In fact, last time we spoke to Chris Millward, who we're going to speak to in a minute. But it's the sense, I think, that people are turning away from it. The numbers of just fractionally, but they have now gone down, of those who are actually applying.
Right.
They look at it and they say, well, look, I could get an apprenticeship, I could just get a job and get some training on the job.
Well, there we are. That's not a problem then, is it? If there's fewer people going to university, then
it is for the universities.
Well, yeah, it is, but we don't need as many of them, and there's not as many people going. Some of them, some of them might go to the wall, and we just go, well, that's a shame. And remembering that every single, all those polytechnics that became universities, we sort of mushroom the numbers of universities that there were,
and the number of people going.
Yeah.
Fast.
So if we take a step back and we lose some, I don't. Do they become more vocational type places rather? Do polytechnics go back? Do universities go back to being polytechnics?
I'm sure they'd never go back to the name, but because they would see that as a move backwards.
But they could become technical colleges.
Yeah, there's all sorts of ways they could go. But the problem that they have still, the massive financial issue, you can't turn the ship around that quickly. And what you're not getting is as many foreign students, and they have been the dirty little secret of what's actually funding our universities for a long time now.
Yeah,
and there's not as many want to come anymore.
Well, possibly even less now. You would have thought out of anywhere in the world you want to go to now
if
to
you
start
happen not
university.
To be British, yes.
Okay. So how does it all end up then? I guess.
Well, the big thing is the government going to do anything financially to support the universities?
Yeah.
I mean, that's highly unlikely, given obviously the big black hole that we've been told exists in the nation's finances.
Yeah.
But then they need a different model because they can't put the fees down, even though, as I say, people coming up with massive loan issues at the end of this.
And we
thing.
want people to go to university. That's the thing.
We want some people to go. I don't know if we want everyone to go to university because, in a sense, then the whole idea of a university is different than it would otherwise be.
Yeah.
Which is somewhere where essentially you're dealing with things. It's not, should a university be teaching you how to make things or how to do stuff, or should it be teaching you how to think?
Teaching you how to think, I think, is the thing, isn't it? I mean, your brain is still developing. I'm not a scientist, but it seems like at 18 to 21, just using your brain.
60 in your case.
I'm a man at 60 who's got the brain power of a 21-year-old because it's still developing.
Which particular 21-year-old would be interested to find out?
Not a very bright 21-year-old, probably.
Right, okay.
But you're still developing your brain capacity at that age. So surely, in a way, does it matter so long as you're still educating yourself?
Maybe, but it certainly matters to the universities because they've got to keep going in some form with the money they can get, whether from foreign students or from students here or indeed from the government. Let's bring in someone to talk about all this who knows about it, and that's Chris Millward, Professor of Practice in Education Policy at the University of Birmingham. And Chris, welcome back. You were with us 2 years ago. We were talking about the idea of degrees and what degrees was valuable, and now I think really it's a different kind of situation, which is regular headlines about the crisis of even the universities existing.
And here's an example. I'm looking at the Office for Students annual report in May this year. The FT reported that 40% of England's universities expected to be in a deficit in the 2023-24 academic year, with an increasing number showing low levels of cash flow, and a significant number will have to make changes to their funding model this year. But, I mean, what changes can they make so quickly?
Okay, so, you're right to highlight the Office for Students report. That's the university regulator, and they are really the most authoritative source of financial information on universities because they collect all the financial forecasts. And they did indeed say that 40% will be in deficit this year. And that would increase if the growth forecast they have for student numbers, universities have for student numbers, aren't achieved. I think being in deficit for 1 year is not in itself a crisis situation. The key question is how you move out of that. And at the most basic level, it's about reducing your costs, and improving your income, like in any other business.
And dealing with the overall issue, which I also saw some stats saying that for the first time, I think for a long while, the number of student applications, people actually wanting to go to university, has actually dropped. Not by a huge amount, but by some. I mean, that is a worrying indicator if you're trying to work out your finances.
But also, what you're saying about reduce costs and improve income. Well, first of all, if you're getting less people coming in, you're getting less income unless you put your prices up. Yeah. And reduce costs means that it's never good, is it? It means you're producing a poorer product at the end of it.
Not necessarily. So you will see stories across the sector about universities deciding to stop running some courses. So they will be making decisions about subjects they think are sustainable in the long term and others that are not. That's not necessarily a great thing for the country, because there are plenty of subjects we want to be sustained across the country because they're important. But that's the obvious way in which universities at the moment are seeking to reduce their costs.
These are the infamous Mickey Mouse courses that various
not necessarily. Actually, no, not necessarily. I mean, I think there's very high levels of demand in areas like business studies and in areas like communications and media that some parts of the press might label Mickey Mouse courses. It can often be and will often be courses with relatively small numbers that have to be closed because they're not viable. You don't have the critical mass. And a great example of that would be languages, for example. So it's definitely not necessarily the Mickey Mouse courses that are the ones that get closed in a climate like this. The better off universities are, the more they're able to maintain a broad portfolio of subjects and essentially cross-subsidize subjects that might be valuable, might be important to people, but don't necessarily cover their costs.
Well, let's talk about the climate. You mentioned, in a climate like this, I mean, the climate is, and the problems they have are the costs to students who might apply or young people who might be thinking of either doing a course, building up a substantial debt, or going straight into work where perhaps they will get some training on the job and won't have to have that kind of thing behind them. I mean, that's an argument that the university sector doesn't seem to be winning at the moment, does it?
I'm a little more positive about demand for higher education than you have been so far. So my understanding of the current situation for UK students is that numbers haven't been growing to the same extent they were for the 10 to 20 years before that. But because the young population, the group of 18-year-olds that are most likely to go to university, will continue to grow for another couple of years, even if the proportion doesn't grow or indeed decline slightly, the numbers will at least be maintained. So I'd be surprised if you ultimately see fewer numbers of young people going into university from the UK this year, although you're not seeing the growth that you've seen previously. And there's probably a couple of reasons for that. One is the cost of living. So it's costly to go to university regardless of the fee levels, which we should talk about at some point. And that may well be deterring students from at least going now. It doesn't mean they won't go in future. And they may also be thinking, well, there are other options I'd like to explore before I decide to do this. Get a job, travel, take an apprenticeship subject to good apprenticeships being available.
Universities a long time ago used to make a lot of money from research, didn't they? I mean, teaching was almost a sideline in some universities, and they were getting money, I guess, from industry, weren't they, as well as from government for funding that research. Has that sort of gone by the way now, or is that still a significant, in some universities, is that still a significant part of their income? And could we do more of it?
Yeah. So research is still a massive component of higher education in the UK. In our system, unlike some other countries, most of the research is done in the universities rather than private, separate research institutes. We have 4 of the top 10 universities in the world, which is really driven in most rankings, which is driven by research performance, and a very substantial proportion of activity and income in research-intensive universities in bodies like the Russell Group will be for research. And many other universities will have strengths in research, albeit not necessarily comprehensive across the university. There hasn't been a reduction in research funding or indeed research activity. It continues to increase. But the key issue with research is it does not make a profit.
So there's no money really comes into universities from the research they do, is what you're saying?
It's funded, but most research makes a loss.
So neutral in effect.
The government does not cover the full costs of research. If you get a grant from one of the publicly funded research councils, you get 80% of the full cost. If charities fund research, and we have fantastic, huge charities like the Wellcome Trust in this country, they cover much less of the cost. They don't pay any overheads. Industry may well cover the full cost, but on the whole, I think universities, that they think they cover about 60 to 70% of their costs on research. So research is a really important part of the business. It has massive benefits for the country in terms of its commercial and public service applications, as well as just the basic foundations of knowledge and the reputation of the higher education sector in the country as a whole. But you don't make money out of it. You make a
right, but somebody probably is down the track, aren't they? So it's like the research is done, the university makes a loss on it, it gets commercialized by a company that makes a mozza, and the university is thinking, oh, hang on, we did a lot of that work. I mean, is there a case that they perhaps need to be a bit more strident in their commercialization of their research?
I think there's been a lot of work done over the last 20, 30 years to really push forward the commercialization research. And the UK is often criticised compared to the US, for example, it's often said we're brilliant at research, but not so good at commercializing it. And as a nation, there's certainly more we can do on that. And you need a good relationship between government, industry, and universities to make that happen. And many people would think that government policy hasn't pushed hard enough an industrial strategy that would make that happen over the last 10 to 20 years. But even then, research in universities, whatever country you're in, is generally loss-making. It's seen to be more of a public good, creating knowledge, and that's why governments fund it. Universities generally pay for their research through students.
Right, and students, of course, are the basis. I mean, just to get the financial model there, we said that research is not a revenue provider for universities. So as we sit now, the universities get their money from the fees of domestic students and overseas students. That's the model. That's it.
Absolutely. And of course, the key issue for the current financial problems is more and more of that money has come through fees rather than government grants. So we're reliant on domestic students paying fees backed by government loans and international students paying fees. The domestic students fee has only increased once since 2012 by £250. So what was a fee worth £9,000 in 2012 is in real terms now worth £6,000. So it's lost a third of its value for each
even
student.
Though people are saying, well, it's too much, in the current circumstances, even though it's come down quite so much, is being used as a reason not to go to university because the fees are so huge, isn't it? And people are worried about that. I guess actually what has happened is the debt has got, the interest rate on the debt has gone up.
Yeah. So it would be more perceptions of debt. And this is not bank debt. This is protected government debt where you pay a percentage of your salary above a certain threshold. But nonetheless, that's a serious issue, paying that part of your salary over a very long period of your lifetime, which has recently extended from 30 to 40 years. So that's definitely something that makes people think very hard about whether they want to do it. But actually, it's the upfront cost of living that is a more immediate barrier, because that's not about something you pay in the future. It's about something you pay now. You get a maintenance loan, but often it's not enough. And that can be a much more tangible barrier.
And obviously, as far as the universities are concerned, the benefit they get from the fees from domestic students, as you say, it hasn't risen in the terms that perhaps it needed to keep up with the costs that the universities incur. What proportion comes from overseas students? I mean, is it right to say that the vast majority of funds that the universities in Britain get are from fees from overseas students?
Not the vast majority. So the key issue, but it's changing all the time. So if you look at the forecasts that universities have put forward for the next 5 years, they're projecting that the international students will increase by about a third. whereas UK students, they're projecting, will increase by much less. And so international fees will become a more and more substantial element of their funding than they are now. And that's in a context where international student numbers have gone up by about 250% over 20 years, whereas domestic students have gone up by about 20%. So the sector is becoming more and more reliant on international students.
And from what I'm hearing, certainly anecdotally, the numbers of foreign students is not necessarily meeting the projections that people wanted, that actually there's been, if anything, a little bit of a downturn. Is that true?
Yeah, so that's right. So the sector has become basically reliant on international students to cross-subsidise research and the teaching of UK students. International markets are inherently more volatile. The numbers are much less reliable. There has been substantial growth in some countries like India, more recently Nigeria. But for countries like that, the numbers can be very affected by immigration policy, for example, and the government had quite a hawkish attitude to student immigration. So certainly the numbers from India look to be slightly down this year. Many universities didn't recruit to what they expected last year. And so this kind of source of funding that's been used to cross-subsidize everything else is becoming increasingly uncertain.
Right. And you say, maybe it's a short-term thing in terms of, the losses that are being made this financial year. But that an article in the FT that was reporting on that students' annual report that I mentioned at the beginning, it says the Russell Group of elite institutions estimate that universities are losing 2,500 on average per student, and that figure is set to rise to 5,000 by the end of the decade. Per annum, per student, yeah. And I guess that is, I guess that is because of what you were saying. The prices aren't going up, the fees aren't going up.
Yeah. In any business, if you're not able to put your price up, then you're going to lose more and more money as inflation increases. And of course, we've experienced in recent years very substantial increases to inflation. So that is really not a sustainable situation. The financial problem is going to get worse and worse.
Right. But it sounds like the elasticity of that. It sounds like if you put the price up too much, then you're going to get fewer students because you're going to accentuate that issue about people going, well, that means more debt. And I really don't want to be put into that situation.
So essentially the model doesn't work, does it? I mean, that's the conclusion. The financial model doesn't seem to work.
Well, it needs rebalancing, doesn't it? Which might mean fewer university places.
Yeah. So firstly, on the price elasticity point, it's actually far from clear that if universities raise upfront fees, that will put students off. If you're a very selective, highly prestigious university, look at the case of the States, they charge very, very high levels of fees and it doesn't put students off because the brand value of having a degree from that university is so substantial. Yeah. And I think in the way our system works, students recognize that the price is not the upfront fee, it's what they pay back in terms of debt over time, which relates more to their salary than the amount they've paid in the fee. So there probably is some elasticity in terms of where the fee could go. I think notwithstanding that, it's politically challenging for a government to want to do it. For what you said earlier, that their fees are already perceived to be high, particularly relative to some other countries. In Scotland, there are no fees at all. So it's not appetizing for any government to want to increase that.
But is it that, the big name universities that are actually suffering the most, or is it going to be the smaller universities? So
the former polytechnics, many of them.
So if you studied geography at Huddersfield, or you're thinking of it, would you do that if the fees were too high? You might say, well, no. Whereas if you were studying economics at LSE, you'd go, well, this is this is prestigious. It's worth paying the money. I also can look at the numbers and go, well, a lot of them find jobs in the Bank of England paying very high salaries. So yes, I'll do that. Thanks.
Yeah.
So it's if there's a clear path, then people will spend the money. But if there's not, they won't.
Yeah, and competition is one dimensional of this. So there's three dimensions to the problem. One is we're more and more reliant on fees in higher education, and the fee is not covering its costs now. The second is we're more and more global in higher education, and that's volatile. And because the fees and the domestic fees not covering its costs, we rely on that to cross-subsidize everything else. The third element is that there's much greater competition than there was 20 years ago. So we have a very competitive system that's been built into the system. Regulation encourages competition between institutions, and that means there are more winners and losers. And as you said, although the most selective universities, the ones that figure highest in the league tables, the ones that have the highest research profile, may suffer most from research not covering its costs. They're generally always going to be able to recruit students. And in fact, many of them did increase student numbers over the last 10 to 20 years, which means some others have been squeezed. So it's probably in other parts of the sector where you're probably going to see the greatest vulnerability.
Okay, so I mean, a bold question: do we have too many universities overall in this country?
I don't think we have too much higher education. I don't think too many people are going into higher education. I do think too great a proportion of our higher education happens through young people studying full time for a full degree between the ages of 18 and 21 or 22. It is a very traditional, expensive way of doing it, particularly if
Actually, I think this was a conclusion from last time we spoke to you, I think.
Yeah.
So you made the point that, people should go to university later rather than earlier, and they might be able to fund themselves.
But that's a longer-term thing of changing the pattern, perhaps. But in the immediate situation, Chris, we've certainly heard suggestions that some institutions simply are going to go bust. I've certainly heard that from friends of mine in the higher education area, saying that they think there are some that will either have to amalgamate or disappear or do something or even go bankrupt. I mean, do you think that's likely, and we will actually have to reduce the number of institutions?
I don't think, given the way the regulation works, and especially given what the new government has said about higher education being the public interest in universities, that a university will be allowed to have a disorderly bankruptcy. If you just allowed a university to go bankrupt, it would affect the confidence in our higher education system worldwide. It would also, and that would of course affect student choices about whether to come to this country. It would affect the rate of interest that universities have to pay banks for lending. So I do not think that we will have a disorderly failure of a university in this country.
But amalgamation, perhaps. I mean, an orderly amalgamation.
Yes, exactly. So I think the territory you're in, if the finances get progressively worse because the fee erodes further in real terms, if demand doesn't increase, and if some institutions are caught in a kind of volatile recruitment trap, where you head to there is some rationalization. So you get into a territory of, possibly some mergers, universities themselves deciding to rationalize their provision so they don't offer as much, but they focus on areas that they can, make sustainable. Some deals done about universities offering some subjects and others picking up the subjects they're no longer going to offer. What you do need for that to happen, though, is some kind of oversight of it, so it happens in an orderly way that protects the interests of the people and the places where universities are based. So many universities have been arguing, so there was a report by Public First a couple of weeks ago arguing that you need a kind of commissioner who would sit above the university system, have some money to support restructuring and transformation to get a more sustainable sector, possibly with fewer universities.
Couldn't that be the Office for Students? Boost that, make it more statutory, give it powers? Wouldn't that work within that?
So the Office for Students does have powers in relation to financial sustainability, and it is exercising those powers, and it has fantastic insights on the financial position of universities. The challenge it does have is that it's responsible for students, so it's responsible for the education mission of universities. And some people have argued for an independent higher education commissioner to oversee all of this, so they will be able to embrace the many different things a university provides in a place. It provides nurses and doctors for the health service. It conducts research with industry and attracts jobs to a place through that route. It has an estate which is used by the public in the place where it's based. It's a great cultural asset. So it may well be that the OFS picks up that role. If it's going to do that, it has to be made explicit that this is about more than protecting student consumers. It's about protecting the broader public interest in universities.
Exactly. Because if you rationalise, so if Huddersfield and Leeds and Bradford became Huddersfield, Leeds, Bradford University, which would be rationalisation in that they'd just lose a couple of campuses, wouldn't they? Get rid of a load of students. So actually, it just becomes Leeds University ultimately. That sort of rationalisation sounds like it's going to get rid of people. But you might have to do that because the sums just don't work otherwise. But if you are rationalising like that, you're going to lose a load of courses, and somebody needs to be there to make sure that there are some courses across the country that don't just disappear. So, for example, if we thought Japanese studies, I don't know if there is such a thing, but if Japanese studies was seen as being something important and we just lost it through closures, and then all of a sudden it becomes very important to our political future or our commercial
but you can't have a course if no one wants to study it. That's the problem, isn't it?
Yeah, but I mean, if people do want to study it but they can't, I mean, it might be a handful of people with a particular
which
vocation.
Which is subsidised.
And but if it goes by the wayside because no one is getting any focus on it, and there's no one over there to say, well, we still need to do that. It may not be very important, but we need to keep our hand in it.
Yeah. So you need a national strategy and a regional strategy for this. At a national level, there are some things we need. We need just enough provision of very specialist languages, which will probably be delivered by quite specialist institutions like SOAS and specialist parts of institutions in places like Oxford and Manchester. And that's very much a national interest. At a more local level, you need somebody to train the nurses, the midwives. You need to make sure that if an institution closes, it doesn't lose the anchor industry that's employing a lot of people nearby and collaborates with the university. So that's why it needs more than just a kind of cold-hearted protect the consumers, move the students to somewhere else point of view. It needs a strategic view at the local and the national level about how to manage this change in a way that protects the public interest.
Could these universities be getting more commercial money as well? I mean, even if it's just sponsorship rights, for example, for more buildings, or do we name
or even name the university? I mean, the American system is very much that, isn't it? You can actually have a Trump University. We won't go there, but the other variants that are possible is that are we simply too squeamish about that?
The American Tobacco School of Midwifery, for example.
I wouldn't go there if I were you.
But I mean that sort of thing, but with reputable brands, for example, because you can see there'd be some benefit for these companies.
I think there's two levels to that. So one is universities have tried much harder than they used to raise money from donors in the way you do in the States. And indeed, a lot of very experienced fundraisers brought over from North America to work in universities. And all universities will be doing that in one form or another. But it's only really a few that can generate serious money from it. Because of their history and their brand and their standing.
But that's not necessarily sponsorship, that's like endowments, isn't it?
Yeah, that's endowments. But look at most, the most elite private universities in the States, they're sitting on vast endowments.
Yeah, Harvard University, I read, $50 billion.
Yeah, and they say, and I know friends of mine who've applied in various ways, or their children have, they are needs blind in a lot of these situations. So if they decide they want you, they have enough in their endowments to actually pay you through the university.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, I don't know, that's a model that I think would be hard to introduce in the UK, wouldn't it?
But why are they getting these endowments and we're not? I guess that's the question. Is it because there must be a greater attachment over there? Because these are obviously people who went to these universities who are paying back money into them.
Yeah, so there's just a different relationship between alumni and universities in the States. I mean, we're all attached to the universities we went to, but we don't have the same culture of giving back to them that they do in the States. We don't support the college football team in the same way that they do in the States. So we have made pretty good progress on that, but it's only a few universities that can really generate serious money out of it. The other area that's very important in this territory is what are employers paying? So we as a nation don't invest in skills anywhere near enough. Or an education and the training of young people. Our employment base is often thought to be quite short-term thinking in terms of that. And apart from some selective larger companies, there isn't the same integration that you might see in some other places between companies and educational institutions, with very long-term investment from employers in skills development. So I would have thought, if you're thinking about what's the way out of this, there's probably a mix of things here which involve some latitude to enable at least an inflationary increase in the fee to avoid this constant erosion, which is not sustainable. Universities themselves having to look hard at the efficiency of what they're doing and making some important steps to reduce their costs. A coherent view nationally and locally about some kind of restructuring and rationalisation to fit the environment we're now operating in, with some public funding probably repayable to make that happen. And then I would have thought this government will be looking for something, contribution from employers as well, with universities actively involved in that. So more training happening through funding with employers. To a certain extent, that happens with apprenticeships now. And Labour has promised to free up the apprenticeship levy to make it more of a broader apprenticeship and skills levy that would enable different types of training, not just very structured apprenticeships. So you might see a world in which more students are getting some kind of funding from employers, which in itself would take you into that territory we were talking about before about studying later in life.
Well, and that's happened for a long time. In things like architecture, for example, you got like a sandwich course where you go. And
engineering has been a long-term thing. But Chris, one of the other aspects of this, and I'm speaking personally, having members of the family involved in the higher education area, isn't there an issue about how much you actually pay the academics? Because a lot of it's been a long time suggested that they know they can get far more money. This is true of the public sector more generally, perhaps, by going abroad. US universities pay a lot better than UK universities. And I suppose the deal is, if you're asking students to pay more to go on a particular course, they'll want to know that it's the kind of course that has the prestige and the worthwhileness that they'd get from attracting the best academics. And that's going to be a difficult thing if you're trying to cut costs, isn't it?
So I don't think... I think it's important not to generalize about the US and the UK, because we're both very diverse. There are some universities in the US that will pay a lot, that are very prestigious research universities. There's also a load of other universities that won't. But it's definitely true at the top end that if you're a leading academic in the UK, you will get offers to work in the US, Australia, elsewhere, China now as well. Where with much higher salary. And so you'll be thinking hard about that. And that's not a new thing. That's not associated with the current financial challenges. More broadly, we don't have a huge problem attracting academics. We recruit loads of academics from overseas because they want to come and work here. I think the main challenge with academic careers is it's very insecure for quite a long period of time. So you're often on short-term contracts early in your career, particularly if you're engaged in research, which can put people off because they want more security from that. So I think yes, there's a set of serious issues about pay bargaining, which will be made harder this year because there's likely to be quite a substantial public sector pay increase, and academic staff will be looking for the same. Why
would it be less, apart from the issues we've been talking about from lack of funding? But I mean, there's still going to be demand there, and in fact, you can argue there's going to be more demand. So I'm looking at a piece that Peter Mandelson wrote in the Times last week, basically saying that that we do need to educate people. It is the human capital that we can't ignore. And then looking at some of the numbers about how many people we send off to university, 58% of 25 to 34-year-olds in the UK have got a tertiary qualification. That's above the OECD average, but if you look at places like Japan, it's 67%. Australia's got a target by 2050 of 80%. Now, that target of 80% perhaps makes sense because you think about, artificial intelligence and automation and how many jobs that are going to be done that don't need very much human brain power. We all need to get smarter because they're going to be the only jobs left. So almost everybody, perhaps, there's an argument, almost everybody needs to go to university.
Or fewer, because some of the skills you need are not going to be ones that you get from universities.
But you're going to have to, but what is going to get you a job is how you use your brain. It's going to be less practical and more brain power. And
both. I mean, I think the important word in what you quoted there was tertiary. So tertiary means quite a broad range of post-compulsory education. embracing what we would call further education that happens in colleges, as well as what we would call higher education that happens in universities.
But everyone should be doing it. We should be going...
Exactly. And I would say all of us need to be engaging with tertiary education of different kinds. I think it is certainly the case that as we become a more service-led economy, as technology influences work more, cognitive skills are important, and adaptability. We've got to adapt to different imperatives in the workplace over a 40 or 50-year career. So you've got to have those cognitive skills, but it doesn't mean that there aren't also some very important practical skills you align with it. And that's why you need to think about a kind of tertiary system where there's more flexible types of learning happening throughout life, rather than this, we've all got to go for 3 years when we're 18 and that's it.
So if there are more people going, I mean, to your point, that could happen later, but if we all ultimately do go at some point in our life onto tertiary education, then that is a lot more than currently. Yeah. So we're sort of like seeing twice as many. And that would mean you'd get economies of scale, wouldn't it? Which would help some of these funding problems that we've been talking about.
But it would require universities to operate differently, to offer that much more flexible, lifelong offer. It's easier for universities to stack up young UK students, domestic, international students. You can get them piled into your hall of residence. You can offer campus services. It's a more economically successful model for them. But if you're going to respond to that world we've all just been talking about, people in work, people studying in later life, you've got to operate much more flexibly. And probably you've got to work more like your colleges and your employer partners do. And so that will require some change in the configuration of what we offer.
And the finance sector would need to play in this as well, to say, well, okay, you can freeze your mortgage for a few years if you're going off to university. I mean, just stuff like that. We need to think about, all aspects of how people
integrated system. Seems unlikely. But Chris, I think we'll have to end it there. But thank you so much for being with us.
Okay, thanks very much.
I'm sure your university will keep going, so don't worry about that.
We're in a good position. We're a strong institution, so we're feeling pretty confident about it.
Glad to hear it.
So the crisis that Roger's warning us about is perhaps he overplayed the mark.
Well, no, there could be some amalgamation. We will see. We will see. Anyway,
right. Good to talk, Chris.
Thanks, Chris.
All right. Okay. Take care.
And obviously next week we can't avoid talking about what has been very much the news this week, all the riots that have been going on across the UK and the causes behind them.
Well, named specifically by the Prime Minister as the far right. Now, what does that mean?
I don't know.
Well, I think a lot of people don't.
I think it's people who've got a Union Jack on their Twitter profile and perhaps a Union Jack tattoo as well,
or an England flag, which seems to be even more pushed on it.
Yeah, but it's very sad, isn't it? The way now we sort of associate our flag.
It is. But what are we talking about? I mean, is this a political movement? Is it just a few guys tanked up with a few slogans and a few too many beers, throwing rocks at someone they don't like?
Yeah.
Is there more to it than that? Is it? We talked about populism.
And where's the boundary between just being right and being the far right?
Well, exactly. I mean, we have Reform MPs in Parliament now. Yeah. Are they far right? Are they not? How does that relate to what's going on the street? What's between them? There's a lot of talk about people manipulating this online. Are they people scheming from a more political area? We just don't know.
And then there's people who will deny that they are far right.
Absolutely.
And then they will say things that make you think, oh no, but you've just demonstrated that you actually are far right.
Well,
so
we'll dig into this.
Even people in the far right can't agree on whether they are or not. Obviously they're going to deny it because it's being used as a derogatory comment.
Yeah, is the Conservative Party, in fact, perhaps concerned that some elements would be on their far right potentially? I mean, we need to look at this, what it all means.
The boundaries of the far right. We'll look at that next time on the Y curve.
You've forgotten what we are.
I do too many podcasts, you know that.
Yes.
The Y curve next week. We'll look at the far right. We'll see you then. Thanks for listening.
The Y curve.